get started. I introduce our speaker to talk today about the scooter program. So today we have Josh Johnson, who serves as the Advanced Mobility Manager for the Department of Public Works in the city of Minneapolis. In this role, Josh focuses on planning, operations, and policy related to the shared electric connected autonomous vehicles. Prior to his time with the city of Minneapolis, Josh was the general manager for Car2Go Twin Cities, overseeing its operations throughout Minneapolis and St. Paul. He also graduated from the Minnesota State University with a Bachelor of Science degree in Business Management. So with that, turn it over to him to give a presentation.
Thanks, everybody. A few familiar faces in the room. As Phil mentioned, so in the Advanced Mobility Manager role, I work with everything related to bikes, scooters, broadly shared mobility, and with that, obviously scooter fit into that category. So just to give you some background on how this developed last year, we were actually thinking about it back in April, well before they launched. We had been working on Nice Ride's introduction of dockless bikes prior to that, and then as we started wrapping that up, scooters were starting to come into national consciousness, particularly in places like Santa Monica and San Francisco, making a lot of waves, and so immediately our attention shifted to that. So we were in the middle of basically getting our ordinance adopted through council the day that Lime launched. Probably not a coincidence. It was the day of the public hearing, actually, of the ordinance, July 10th. And then 10 days later, that was Bird launched. And then 10 days later, Lime launched with their own scooters. And we chose to embrace it. We chose to see it not as a threat, but as an opportunity to leverage technology to reach our goals, particularly around providing an option that can get people thinking differently about how they're moving around the city, giving somebody the ability to reconsider their personal car as their main mode of transportation. We saw it as an opportunity to leverage new technology to reach those goals, and so we chose to work with the companies to really be a partner with them while we were getting our regulation through council, both the ordinance and then a subsequent license agreement. We asked them to abide by our draft regulations. They did. Both were willing partners in that. So we started with 100 scooters total, 100 scooters each, 200 scooters total in August of 2018. Both shared that 100 scooter mark, and then we increased to 300 in September. This included some distribution requirements in lower income neighborhoods in Minneapolis. For those of you that are familiar with them, Phillips, Cedar Riverside, and North Minneapolis. We then increased to 200 scooters each, 400 scooters total in September, and then in October. The U also began their pilot around the same time. They had a separate pilot which required that scooters be distributed to the U in the morning, but then could be ridden and parked on city right-of-way from there throughout the day. And then they increased their own allotment of scooters to 200 total. So at peak, we had 600 scooters total operating in Minneapolis, and then we both ended our pilots on November 30th of last year. So that's kind of how it developed in 2018. From there, we really took 3 months of hard analysis on what scooters meant to the city, not only the usage data that we collected, survey data that we collected from both companies, and also feedback that we received via 3-in-1, some direct feedback via mail, email, and phone calls. I have this screen included, or this slide included, just to illustrate kind of the role of data. I identified from the beginning in how we developed our policy that data was really a key part of it to really understanding what scooters meant to the city, how they were operating, were they a benefit or were they a burden, and with that did not have any idea what our capacity would be. So I included regulations that got us access to data, but I did not know how we were going to actually take in that data, store that data, analyze that data. I lucked into that capacity through our IT staff, some very progressive folks who very quickly found this to be the most interesting thing they were doing, and thankfully put a lot of time and effort into it to help build the platforms that we did. And so this is just kind of illustrating their the data and analytics team overall strategy: acquire, govern, safeguard, use, and enable. Essentially, we needed to ensure that we were accessing data smartly, protecting our residents' privacy, protecting the company's proprietary data, but also getting the value out of it that we needed to make policy decisions, to make infrastructure decisions, and I'll get into a couple of those things in a few minutes. But really kind of unlocking that data to be able to continue to leverage, again, scooters to reach our goals. So this is an example, or shows a little bit about how we took in that data and essentially created our own model of it. So we got raw data from the companies, which reported essentially every time the GPS pinged, which was based on either events or a heartbeat that it got, that the company got, that we then accessed through their APIs. And so what we did is essentially set up a gateway where all data was processed in memory, and that's where our anonymization took place. So we took the original trip IDs from the company that we got, set them aside, and generated our own unique trip IDs. We also then took the trip times and routed them to the nearest half hour at 15-minute increments. And so essentially, as you see here, if you started the trip at 12:04 and ended at 12:23, it rounds to 12 and 12:30 accordingly. We then also sorted and grouped the trip start and endpoints, and actually we took that a step further and did it with the essentially the routing points along the way as well. And so the graphic that you see at the bottom is just illustrating that, say this was somebody's house. They started a trip outside their house on the west side of the street. This represents the center line here. And so what happened is we took one of 3 points, which was closest, moved it to the center line, and then binned it or aggregated it based on where it was in proximity to those 3 points, whether it was mid-block or on either side, one or the other. And so what that did is ensured that with the rounding of the time and that aggregation and anonymization, we were preventing the ability of someone to do a data request, get that data from us, and re-identify someone's trip. And so there's been some news from a variety of sources. If you may have been following kind of the national conversation about scooters, this is a kind of a peak concern among all of the companies. But this has also been shown that I think somebody took the New York Taxi and Limousine Commission data, accessed it, and re-identified I don't know how many people's personal trips down to the point where I think they identified somebody going to Planned Parenthood from their home. And so that was really important for us from the beginning to ensure that anything we stored was aggregated and anonymized in this way. We threw out any raw data that was not stored, that was not accessible to the city in any way, and that it's also controlled by a select group of individuals. So any data requests that we get from the public, of course, goes through the appropriate channels, but internally, any data request that we get essentially starts with me, and it has to be for a very specific purpose. So why are you wanting to see this data? Is it for planning? Is it for infrastructure? Is it because you're just interested? If you're just interested, I can give you this presentation. But if you actually want to work with the data in some meaningful way, then we can start talking about who has access and how we kind of unlock it from there. So this is a screenshot of what we set up as our compliance dashboard. So essentially what this shows is, it says 15-minute availability. We could have gone real time, but this is the idle location of all, or the scooters that were idle at any given point in time, represented in those kind of hex bins there. As you zoom in, you get to like the individual locations of those scooters. What we used this for last year and this year is to monitor their compliance with our cap. So we set a certain amount that they could have of scooters in the city at any one point. This year it's 500. Last year, as I mentioned, it was 200 per company. So we use this to identify whether or not they're complying with our cap. We also used this last year to just kind of keep an eye on distribution. Primarily, they were located downtown in the Dinkytown area, some in Uptown, some scattered a few other places. But that's where they focused their efforts, kind of the densest parts of the city, their core kind of wheelhouse area. We took that a step further this year and put some hard requirements on them for distribution, particularly in low-income neighborhoods. As I mentioned, we call them areas of concentrated poverty, but north, northeast, and south Minneapolis, they're required to have at least 30% of their scooters distributed in those areas. And then a cap of no more than 400 or 40% to downtown. And so we're using this dashboard to really maintain that compliance aspect. What you see on the right is a bar graph just showing green represents Lime, blackish gray represents Bird, just showing the number of scooters in graph form. This is a slide showing what we've done with or what we found with some of the data. So we had 225,000 rides in the period July 10 to November 30th last year, about 1,500 rides per day. I'll give you a little perspective of this year. So far, we have Lime and Spin launched. Lime yesterday had 2,500 rides of their own. And so with much bigger, and I'll get into a little bit of the kind of the implications from last year to this year and how our policy has changed. With many more scooters, they've gotten much more use. And even I was looking for a scooter. I was downtown at City Hall trying to make my way to the west side of downtown to get to my car, and there was still lacking availability in scooters. I was going to take one from there to get to my car, and we still didn't have enough. So I think that shows some perspective in the appetite of scooters in the city. We had almost 75,000 unique users last year, 302,000 total miles ridden, about 1.34 miles per ride, 18 minutes per ride. We had a high of 39 trips in one day on an individual scooter. So that's not necessarily consecutive. It's not necessarily dedicated to one part of the city. It could be that it was ridden, needed to be charged, relocated to another part of the city. But we found that there was that one day where one scooter had 39 trips in one day. And then this graphic on the left, the heat map, shows that 93% of the city streets and our off-street trails were ridden on last year. So even though scooters were primarily distributed to the red areas, downtown and Dinkytown, they made it all the way north, south, east, and west. And that really helped inform our decision to have much broader requirements on distribution for the companies, in that despite that very limited distribution last year, there was pretty broad use. And so we used that as the opportunity to kind of make that policy decision this year. This slide shows some statistics from our survey that we did, one with each company. We had almost 1,000 responses. 62% responded as using multiple times per month, 19% multiple times per week. 69% responded that availability prevented them from riding more often. This is an interesting one. 35% responded as non-users of bicycles. So that's likely those who are very unfamiliar with the bike network and more likely to ride on the sidewalk. And so one of the decisions we made this year was to establish a fee that could support some infrastructure pilots to be able to make people more comfortable in our bike network. Not that we don't have, a world-class bike network now, but we've got data to support. With all of these new users, we need to do a little more to make people more comfortable and get them understanding that scooters are to be ridden in the bike lane, in the streets. We can make you comfortable doing so. I'll get into what those pilots are in a few minutes, but it was definitely informative for how we structured our fees this year. 42% stated a decrease in their use of personal vehicles, TNCs, or taxis with access to scooters. So we're getting vehicles off the road. That's particularly important for me. This is not just a novelty item. This is a meaningful transportation choice for people. And we're taking, by having scooters, we're actually starting to take some action towards our climate mitigation strategies. And illustrating the kind of the graphic on the right, 95% selected a real destination when they reported on their most recent trip rather than just riding for fun. And so what you see on the right is kind of a flow chart of where scooters were reported to be ridden of those kind of buckets there. As you see, all the way at the bottom is riding for fun. Primarily it's home to work, school, dining, work to home, school, other destinations. And so it was clear to us that while there was certainly an element of novelty to scooters last year, particularly if you look at like heat maps around the lakes, Stone Arch Bridge, a variety of points of interest, there was certainly novelty associated with it, but that it was a very meaningful transportation choice for people. We got some demographic information from the survey as well. 61% responded as living in Minneapolis, 25% in the greater Twin Cities, 68% male, 88% white, average age of 30, which is a little surprising. That seems a little old to me, but if you've been in Minneapolis and generally seen the average user, that doesn't seem consistent with that, but it's actually pleasantly surprising, honestly. 70% responded as a household income of $50,000 or greater, 19% below the poverty line, 11% own zero cars, 34% one car, 55% two. What these 5 statistics told me is that we have a lot of work to do to broaden the audience in Minneapolis, and that was part of that policy decision to make distribution requirements in areas of concentrated poverty, and then also follow that up with ensuring that the companies are doing some meaningful engagement in those neighborhoods. We put out an RFQ for selection of the vendors that we move forward with this year, and one of the very crucial pieces, and one of the very most important pieces of who was selected was those who responded to the RFQ showing that they wanted to be a community partner, that they wanted to be able to be working in neighborhoods in Minneapolis, having the opportunity for people to test ride, giving away helmets, working with those organizations who are focused in North Minneapolis, in Cedar Riverside, in Phillips, in those disadvantaged communities, and really making scooters a meaningful choice for those people and not just token placement to say, we're trying to be equitable with this program, that there's some meaningful engagement behind it as well. And the city is putting some skin in the game too, so we're hopefully ramping up efforts here in the next month or so to work with our neighborhood community relations department or division to really get out into those neighborhoods with those who are most connected and just have opportunities to talk about it, working at events like Open Streets and other opportunities where we can just have scooters available, allow people to ask questions, maybe try them in a more comfortable environment than downtown or a busy street where they may have a bad experience and not try it again, and be able to show why this could be a meaningful transportation option for people. This is representing our complaint data. So we had 85 complaints received last year through 311, 46 parking, 35 riding, 4 damaged scooters. Of those, 3 were submitted by individuals with a disability. 4 reported crashes. Actually, that should be 6. No severe injuries were reported, and then 9 reported near misses involving scooters. So of this slide, the takeaway here is that there was likely a lot that went unreported. But the good thing for me, obviously any crashes are to be taken seriously, but the fact that there were only 4, no severe injuries, when the national conversation, and it is certainly overblown in how this is talked about nationally, but that scooters aren't as dangerous as people think. And certainly there's a need to educate people on riding safely, on using helmets, on ensuring that we're doing our part to enable appropriate use of scooters. But at the same time, there's an element of, if we're getting people out of cars onto scooters, we're contributing to our efforts at Vision Zero. We're inherently making the streets safer by not having 3,000-pound hunks of metal potentially interacting with pedestrians and bicyclists. You're almost certain to walk away from a crash with a scooter. So that's an important aspect of safety to me. So with the 2018 pilot, we came to the following conclusions, and these are based on our draft transportation action plan goals. They contributed to a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions and vehicle miles traveled. Safety and accessibility was and still is a primary concern. Equitable access was certainly lacking. Scooters did provide a meaningful transportation option to access education and jobs. They were a meaningful mobility choice throughout the pilot, and close collaboration with a variety of stakeholders helped contribute to the success of last year's pilot. So after evaluating that, taking, like I said, about 3 months, starting November 30th to put together this pilot proposal, and this is what was presented to our city council, our recommendation was to renew and extend the pilot for a 1-year term through March of next year. The intention there is that after November 30th, we will make a day-to-day decision on whether or not scooters can be put out. Last year, we could have likely had scooters available through the month of December. It would have been cold, but we did certainly see use in November when it was cold. As long as there's not snow and ice, we were willing to, and 10 degrees below zero, we're willing to allow that. And so it'll be kind of a day-to-day decision. And then, of course, March of this year, there would have been certainly opportunity for scooters to be ridden. Again, maybe a little bit uncomfortable, but there were certainly people who were willing to do that last year. At least 2, but no more than 4 participants. So I mentioned the RFQ process. We selected Lime, Lyft, Spin, and Jump in our RFQ process. This year, we are working through final signatures on the agreement with Lyft, but Spin and Lime have both launched. Lime has their full 500 out. Spin is I don't even know what they're at, but they're not very close to that at this point. Interested vendors had to submit an application, which included how they would ensure safe riding and parking, how they would get that local education and outreach engagement plan going, and then what their availability and distribution plan was for scooters. And it requires a low-income pricing and alternative access program. So when I say alternative access, that means for those who don't have a smartphone, who don't have a bank account, there's an option for you. So generally the options that have been proposed are either ability to use prepaid cards, having some sort of network to pay with. So there's a program called Pay Near Me that Lime used last year, which is essentially like 27,000 stores where you could go and reload money onto your account, and that would be good for you to use. Then they also had like text to unlock or customer service lines that you could call if you didn't have a smartphone or a data plan that supported use of the app. We also put in place minimum and maximum distribution requirements. I talked about those. All told, we are allowing a maximum of 2,000 scooters, 500 per each company, or split evenly between the companies. So with those 4 that we selected, that represents 500. We have the ability to increase or decrease the maximum number of scooters based on performance targets, or essentially for any reason that we see that threatens public safety and health. If scooters become such a burden, we can certainly reduce the number of scooters. We can suspend the program. We can eliminate one of the vendors. We have that latitude with our agreements. The fee of $100 per scooter, so that's essentially intended to support oversight and regulation of the program. So there's going to be staffing hired hopefully in the next month or so, so that I don't have to think about and look at scooters on a day-to-day basis. There is going to be some support for our IT staff in terms of potentially either sharing or maybe outright a data scientist hired on for more broadly public works. And then also with what's left over, supporting some infrastructure improvements. So with the data that we collected last year, we took, and we've also done some curbside mapping of our downtown area, where I compared the use of last year origins and destinations with our curbside use. That's essentially low-hanging fruit, not removing any on-street car parking, but where it may not be operationally necessary. So no parking zone, corner clearance. We've even talked about possibly locating dedicated scooter parking in front of fire hydrants, having opportunity to provide dedicated space for scooters to be parked. And there's a few benefits to that. One is obviously just having more space available in congested areas, trying to enable or encourage good behavior by locating not only near hotspots, but also in proximity to our bike network, and then also in areas where it may be congested. If you're seeing a scooter parked in the street, that may engage in your mind, and you have to walk out to the street to go get it. The hope is that it engages in your mind that I'm supposed to be riding in the street in the bike lane as well. And then also just kind of enhancing visibility, like having some dedicated place for scooters, being able to show people, it doesn't necessarily have to be anywhere and everywhere. You can have this dedicated space. Docked bike share is still a thing, even though dockless has come and gone, because people do want that security of knowing I can park my scooter here, or I know I can access my scooter here. And so there's a few different benefits to doing that. And then also just the idea of piloting it to try and gather some data on how this may help enhance the experience, not only for users, but non-users as well. We're also looking at potentially adding some lane markings in certain places, particularly on corridors where we have high use, to be able to, again, kind of reinforce that idea that you're supposed to be riding in a bike lane. We're looking at a few opportunities there this year. Hopefully midsummer we'll be able to roll that out and test it. The third thing that we're doing with regard to infrastructure pilots is looking at where we might be able to add additional protection in certain areas. And so Minneapolis is a pretty robust network of protected bikeways, but we did see through some of the data that there may be opportunity for more. And we have some of these fees. We're not necessarily going to be able to enhance 10 miles of bikeways with these fees, but we can certainly test in some corridors and see how that changes people's behavior. So all of those things will hopefully be a part of this year's pilot and really inform what we can do going forward, not only with the fee structure, but just generally how we can influence people's behavior with these new modes and if you're following the national conversation, there's constant iteration on this. There's three-wheeled scooters. If you've seen or heard of VMO, it's essentially an electric bike that has three wheels and body panels on it. There's so many iterations of micromobility, it's called now, where we just need to make sure we're staying ahead of that, and part of that is the infrastructure to support it as well. And so looking at the goals of this year's pilot, one piece of it is really to inform what we're going to do long term. And it may be that we make the decision that long term we just have to take this on a yearly basis. But we really want to get an understanding of, with broader distribution, with these infrastructure pilots, with hopefully many more people using scooters, what's going to be our long-term approach to this. With that, what's the actual impact on greenhouse gas emissions and vehicle miles traveled? We're also, in this year's pilot, we're requiring the companies to report to us vehicle miles traveled of their support operations. And so one thing we want to make sure of is, if we're adopting scooters as a meaningful transportation option for people in Minneapolis, that we don't run into a situation like with Uber and Lyft, where their cars have shown to be actually adding to congestion, be actually adding to the potential for additional emissions by having them on the road. So we just want to make sure that they're not offsetting the good that they're doing by having scooters available and getting people out of their own cars. Safety and accessibility is still a primary concern, as I mentioned. So how can we continue to support that, ensuring we're maintaining order in our right-of-way for all users, not just prioritizing scooter users in any way, or bicyclists, that we're really having that balance. Equity, so how can we continue to make this a viable transportation option for all in Minneapolis and not just some? How do we contribute to economic growth? And so when I point that out, what I really mean there is that these companies were selected also on the basis of what their local staffing plan was. And with that, we were evaluating them based on how they were structured, how much they were dedicated W-2 employees versus independent contractors who were maybe being paid $10 per scooter that they picked up, but weren't actually earning a living wage based on it. Certainly, for some, that supplemental income is meaningful, but we did want to make sure that the companies that we were moving forward with had a presence in our city, had the ability, or had the offering of local jobs to people, in a meaningful way that really added to the overall benefit of having scooters in our city. Mobility, so how scooters are used to connect with transit and other modes. Last year we found there was very little connection to transit, primarily because of their limited distribution and their limited trip length. They were generally used in place of other modes rather than to connect to other modes. And so by offering scooters in many more neighborhoods, much further out from the core of the city, from the core of our job centers and destinations, points of interest, the hope is that we can primarily position scooters, outside of downtown as a meaningful connection, first mile, last mile gap to transit, using that to kind of create a multimodal lifestyle for people. And again, nudge people from considering using their car as their primary mode of transportation to what are all these other options and how they can help me connect to every part of the city and even the region. And then what types of collaboration are key to long-term success? So with that, stand for any questions. Yeah.
2 questions. Was the 2018 pilot program profitable for both Lyft and Bird?
Lime and Bird.
Sorry.
There are, so I don't actually have any of their revenue stats, but the national conversation does revolve around how scooter companies are not profitable at this point. They rely on either venture capital or a much larger company backing them. So Lime relies on venture capital. It's valued at multi-billions of dollars at this point. Jump is owned by Uber. Lyft has its own scooter line. Spin is owned by Ford. So kind of what's happened is there's been this rapid expansion of companies that I think were primarily trying to position themselves to either get bought out or build this gigantic amount of venture capital. And then, there was a pretty rapid contraction as well to some of these major players. And there's still like 12 companies out there that are kind of competing for various cities in how they're rolling out their programs. But generally, no, scooters aren't profitable at this point. It's a national topic of conversation about how the unit economics of scooters at this point doesn't make sense based on the longevity of the scooter itself. So generally, last year and even into this year, the scooters that were used were based on a personal, like, commute type scooter, like you would go and buy one on Amazon. They just kind of co-opted them for these shared services, but they were not built for the type of use that they saw in this shared system. And so we saw in our data, actually, the average lifespan was about 32 days of the scooters. So we would, and so that was, it was an assumption, but essentially tracking the unique ID that they assigned to the scooter from start to when it disappeared, essentially. We saw an average about 32 days, and that's pretty consistent with what's happened nationally. The companies are now, so Bird and Lime are now going directly to manufacturers and essentially designing scooters from the ground up to be much more robust. And so they're starting to change that narrative, but it's still a consideration that all of the companies have. It was something that I certainly went back and forth on, especially in regard to our fee structure. Is this going to contribute to their potential decline, disappearance? We certainly experienced that with Car2Go and the Twin Cities. There were much bigger implications there, but it was something that I went back and forth with. But to ensure that we were able to build the pilot that we needed, to build the structure that we needed to support the pilot, that fee was necessary. And the intention is that it's kind of a one-time starter fee, essentially, and then in subsequent years we can scale that back. Now that we have, that capacity built, we can kind of keep it self-sustaining at a lower level. But going back to the original question, generally I would say no, likely not. It was not profitable for companies.
All right. The second question was, has there been much of a reaction from the bike community to having to share their lanes?
Actually, there was a bit of consternation from the beginning. So I'm referencing conversations I had with our bicycle advisory committee. I think it was more just kind of curiosity or just lack of understanding at first. But I think they quickly realized that this could also contribute to their goals as well. Better infrastructure, better wayfinding, more people in the bike lane, more users being visible to cars, makes it safer for everyone. And so I think that's how the narrative developed for them, is that, yeah, it may be a challenge at times. Certainly we saw and heard about scooter riders going the wrong way, down one way, people being passed and, feeling comfortable. So yes, there are challenging interactions, but I think the overall potential benefit for them is greater than, the kind of those individual challenges that they face. Yeah.
I just want to say that I'm really excited about this program and really excited about the use of data and stuff. But my question is there any thought to moving towards like a more of a unified platform? Like right now, this means getting like 4 different apps plus like your transit app and Grab for Nice Ride. Is there any look to like combining some of those, or?
Yeah, it's in the works. So in our agreement, we also required that they give us an API called General Bike Share Specification Feed Specification, GBFS, which is to be made available for public consumption. So essentially, what we're going to do with that is turn around and either build the platform ourselves or send it to like the transit app or others who are interested, so that they can at least aggregate them in one place. You can't access the scooter using that. You can just see them all in one place, so at least you don't have to switch from app to app. That's the starting point. You still have to pass through to the individual app. The next level of that is trying to integrate access and payment, and that's something we're pursuing as well on a bigger picture with our transportation system as a whole. It's gonna take some work, but we've had conversations with Metro Transit, with their app provider Movil, with the transit app, and I think we have some opportunity there. We have to obviously engage the providers to ensure they're willing partners, but the idea is that we find some common platform like PayPal, for example, where we don't have to build a whole new software platform. We don't have to necessarily retrofit buses with new technology. It's something that we can just use on the back end and hopefully provide a more seamless experience for people on the front end. We're also looking at that with an eye towards, again, the low-income, low-tech individuals, where what is a platform we can use, or maybe it's just a matter of policy decisions where we can provide that similar level of kind of seamless experience. So maybe it starts with a Metro Transit decision to allow free transfers from bikes and scooters, and then builds from there to, can we incorporate the GoTo card or some other means to be able to allow kind of a mobility wallet where you can access multiple modes in one place. We're even thinking about, can we implement kiosks in certain places to kind of bridge the gap to for those who may not have a smartphone or data plan. So yes, we're working on it. It may not materialize for a year or so, but it is something we're definitely moving towards. Yeah.
I've got two questions as well. Going back to your interactions with certain groups.
Yeah.
Have you done much work in your research with interactions with motorists, both in the education of motorists and suiting their needs as far as not having to worry about scooters traveling into their lane or visibility issues? They're smaller than bicycles, so you can't see them. Have you been speaking with motorists?
So to that end, really, the only thing we've done is we put out kind of a general 3-question survey to essentially all the neighborhood associations in Minneapolis as we were building to this policy this year to say, essentially, did you ride a scooter last year? Do you want a scooter in your neighborhood this year? And then kind of tell me what you think. What other comments do you have? And so we got some to that effect through that survey. We also had a few conversations with stakeholders about, does it make sense to incorporate this into driver's education at some level? Having a 4-month pilot last year, it didn't necessarily make sense to pursue that very hard, at least to start out this year. But I think it's something we'll continue to engage, like the Department of Public Safety, when we have opportunities with neighborhood associations. Certainly we'll have that engagement and then just continue to collect feedback throughout the year. Unfortunately, there's not a good platform to reach solely those non-users and try and get that question answered. But certainly it is something that we're considering.
Okay. And how do you plan to make the whole program work with neighboring municipalities? Have you been speaking with neighboring municipalities, so scooters cross city lines, especially St. Paul, because they have a similar scooter program? So have you been partnering with those municipalities, and how do you plan on managing the scooters that leave the city lines, essentially?
Going back to last year, we engaged a group of anybody who was being approached by, at that point, both bike and scooters, and essentially built this monthly group of all of the western suburbs, the University of Minnesota, Park Board in Minneapolis, and then St. Paul, just to talk about what was happening and try and align our efforts. So with different goals in all of the cities, it's, there's certainly different approaches, but I think one of the things that's been helpful is that we've been able to collaborate from a policy perspective. So at least in how we're thinking about which companies to select in participating, how our regulations are built or structured, how essentially the operations look in each city. It's pretty similar across the board. It's kind of developed that Minneapolis started with it, and this is how it played out with Uber and Lyft in 2013 as well. It started first in Minneapolis, so we developed regulations first based on pretty much copy and paste from other cities. And then from there, it kind of just developed in each suburb who was thinking about this or actively working on it in St. Paul, and they just kind of build off each other. So thankfully, we've been able to I think build some close coordination to that end. Ben and I spoke yesterday about data. I'm happy to ensure that we can build a more seamless regional approach as much as possible. Certainly, as I mentioned, different goals, differences of opinions based on providers. We're not going to be able to dictate what happens in the region, but at least getting everybody together in a room, being able to talk about what's happening, how you're thinking about it, and share ideas is really a strong step towards kind of building that holistic approach. To the question about crossover, that's up to the companies to figure out.
Okay.
We have kind of a position of you can certainly ride to and through Minneapolis from any of the other municipalities where scooters exist, even if they're not permitted, if they're a company that's not permitted in Minneapolis. But if you leave it there, then it needs to be picked up and brought back to wherever it originated from. So with that, we're really putting it on the companies to kind of police themselves to that end. And it's been pretty seamless so far. You know, if you think about the crossover between Minneapolis and St. Paul, there's not really good connections. You have to go over bridges where people are traveling, you know, much faster than you're probably comfortable with, except Franklin Avenue is probably the best opportunity, and maybe the U of M Transit Way. So there certainly is some crossover, but I think generally, you know, it's pretty limited. And then, you know, from St. Louis Park, from Edina, Golden Valley, who are all considering or implementing their own pilots, there's going to be some crossover, but it's not like hundreds of scooters, you know, going back and forth. Yeah.
So a couple things. Sorry. One, what in putting together your program? Are there other major cities around the country, or where did you find either inspiration or peers or other kinds of like minds implementing programs? You know, where's kind of another comparable that it'd be even more advanced than what the city's at, or on their way, or
So our initial agreement was primarily structured based on San Francisco's, but then from there, this year, you know, I've been looking at DC, Denver, Kansas City, Indianapolis, Salt Lake City, Portland. So it's all, you know, there's variations among all of us, but it's kind of similar to the regional collaboration in that everybody just kind of builds off each other. So there's not necessarily one that's like unique from all the others. It's kind of variations of, you know, whoever started first. So really it was Santa Monica and San Francisco. You know, some aren't, you know, there's not a lot of people who are thinking about the infrastructure pilots that we're doing, like the staffing that's supported by the fees. There are certainly some, but I think we're somewhat unique in that. Our approach to data, I will toot our horn for that. I don't think there's many who have taken the comprehensive approach that we have, both in protecting privacy, but also using data for specific purposes, not just to say, hey, I've got scooter data. Like that's something that, you know, certainly cities have done, you know, saying, hey, I got this cool data, but I don't know what I'm actually going to do with it. We actually have meaningful plans for it. How can we enhance our bikeway network? How can we implement, you know, other infrastructure to support this? What kind of policy decisions do we need to be made? Do we need to make based on use? All of those kind of things. And so I think that's where we're most unique. There's not many cities, maybe 2 or 3 others that are really thinking on that level and doing everything that we're doing. There are a lot of third parties out there that are trying to provide platforms for people to visualize data, both on kind of the real-time side and the planning side. We built that ourselves, and so I think that's where we're probably most unique in both the policy and the implementation of it.
A couple online questions. One was, how long after you implemented the program did you start evaluating data?
So we started with the real-time kind of the compliance and monitoring pretty quickly after the pilot started within the first month. The planning analysis side, like that heat map that you saw, the visualization that we were doing based on the actual use, both origins, destinations, routing, all those kind of things, that didn't really start until probably December when we collected all of that data, did our anonymization, our aggregation, and then started building those visualizations. We've gotten to the point of we have kind of a tool that visualizes our 5 or 6 types of bike infrastructure, and then you can select one, see the associated use based on those routes throughout the city. We built tools based on points of interest, so you can select Stone Arch Bridge and just see how many trips are on the Stone Arch Bridge. We have a few variations of those kind of things that we built since then, you know, like I said, starting in December, that are useful for us in those planning and policy decisions. But yeah, it didn't start until about a month after the pilot ended.
Okay.
And now it's going to be an ongoing basis. Basically, we're going to do a retroactive look back pretty much a week at a time. So we're not actually accessing any routing or trip data in real time. It's only the location of idle scooters. And then we're going back, you know, from the previous week and looking back at what the actual routing and trip data shows.
One last thing, how did you feel, like, rating it kind of 1 to 10, 10 being the best, how did you feel the program evaluated out last year? Did you feel comfortable? Was it?
I mean, it's a hard question to answer because we haven't experienced anything like it before.
Sure.
And scooters are such a unique thing. I would say maybe an 8. I think just given that they launched without warning, really without strong collaboration to start, we quickly got there. But, that it wasn't the city bringing this in and introducing it, you had to react to it. Certainly as I mentioned, the crashes were concerning, the complaints were concerning, although they were relatively minimal. But I think, there was a lot of strong points to it. And, it's a reason why we were able to convince our council to go from 400 last year to 2,000 this year. And, hopefully many more going forward as we continue to see adoption.
It'll be really interesting to see how the next evolution
Yep.
works.
Yep.
Sorry.
Sort
Go
of
ahead.
quick one, I guess. Sort of related to your last point. When do you think you'll transition from a pilot program to more of an ongoing, multi-year commitment?
I don't know that we will know that. I think because so much is changing with scooters, it may be that our commitment is to just do continued one-year pilots until something stabilizes. I think it will be really hard after this year to be able to say, we know exactly how this is going to play out, so we're willing to commit to 3 to 5 years, of exclusive vendors, if that's the case, or, exclusive regulation of some sort. That I think we just have to be nimble with it, and as it continues to shift, and particularly as the question about like the unit economics continues to play itself out, can it continue to be meaningful in the way that we're regulating it, or do we need to do more to accommodate it if we see it as the benefit that, at least it showed last year? And so I think there's too many questions hanging out there to be able to confidently say, after this year, we'll be able to build a long-term policy.
Yeah, I think you mentioned privately owned schools. Any idea how many are are you doing anything to regulate those, or is there
No.
any revenue generation off of those? They have to
So-
buy a license, or?
Scooters are generally regulated in state statute, actually going back to 2006, and that was not intended to be shared scooters, but privately owned scooters. It actually fits the definition of what's out there today pretty well. So that's the regulation that we have for it. That's something that we don't necessarily need to change at this point based on how the definition, how the statute is written today. Like I said, it fits pretty well. As far as the number of privately owned scooters, I have no clue. I've seen a few parked, locked to bike racks downtown, but just no capability to really collect that data. I will say, for some perspective, I saw on social media, there's a guy I follow that talks quite a bit about scooters, and he was talking about Paris, where there are 25,000 shared scooters, but 250,000 privately owned scooters. And he was putting in the perspective of kind of nationally in North America and even Paris, thinking about how much use of however many scooters you have, it still is really a drop in the bucket, even though we had 225,000 trips. Comparing that to the car use that is, that makes up our city, that's really a very small percentage of that. And to make meaningful change, we need to get to a place like that where it's not only this robust shared system that everybody can consider using, but also it's enough of an attraction for people that they make the consideration to buy their own and start using it regularly. So, I'm not necessarily trying to compare Minneapolis to Paris, but just to say that, I think that would be welcomed if at some point we can continue to build this into a meaningful transportation option beyond this shared system to a point where people are considering buying their own. And certainly there has been some of that from last year's pilot, but not at the scale that we're talking about in the context of Paris. Yeah.
And I mentioned something about the competition for space and parking, and that something that I work with is accessibility. And so I've seen enough times where I'm walking on the sidewalk and these things get parked in just kind of careless ways. I mean, I don't know that regulation can really help that because there's not a whole lot of enforcement on the individual, I would imagine. But what are some things that the city's doing to address that?
Yeah, so this operations position hopefully will be hired in the next month, and their primary role will be essentially out in the field, and they'll be the one kind of coordinating that enforcement effort. In the meantime, one of the things that we've done is, obviously, we're putting it on scooter companies first and foremost to police themselves in that area, but we're also engaging partners like the Downtown Improvement District, like our traffic control folks, MPD, Public Works in general, just to say, if you see a scooter that's knocked over, if it needs to be moved 2 feet, can you just go ahead and do that? And not necessarily putting that burden on them, but if they're able, if they're willing to do that, and park it properly. We certainly want to be able to still collect data on that too. So we're trying to kind of kill two birds with one stone there, where it gets reported, but then it also gets fixed, immediately. If it's, something where it is overburdensome or it's someone from the general public, we're not asking them to correct that for us, but just report it. So one of the efforts on the city side this year is to really strongly encourage people to report as much as possible through 3-in-1. We have it in our C-Click Fix app, or it can be direct communication with myself. But to be able to collect that data, because if we don't know about it, we can't address it. We obviously have the regulation in place for the companies, and they have a few different structures to basically monitor that. So the companies that we've selected have all stated that they would hire essentially people to rove the streets and not just like collect scooters to be charged, but to actually look out for that. There was, they have cute names for all of their types of workers. Lime chargers are called juicers. Bird proposed people as bird watchers. So the companies are doing that as well. So we're doing our best to kind of attack it from both angles, but making sure that it's not a burden on the city. It's really put on the companies first. But we have the ability to enforce. We have the ability to correct it if needed. And based on the data that we have, we can look back at like 3-in-1 complaints from the previous day where scooters are. So I'll give you an example. If we got 30 complaints from 6th and Nicollet yesterday, and we see that there are 30 scooters there today, that may be an area for this operations person to focus on, where they go down and maybe hand out some information to people riding scooters to say, hey, did you know you can't ride on the sidewalk? Did you know you have to park here, et cetera? Or they can coordinate enforcement if needed. So that can be kind of a focus of that role based on data. And certainly they're not going to cover the entire city, but we don't need them to cover the entire city. It's just going to be those key areas where the kind of hot spot of activity is. And then we can also coordinate with the companies accordingly too. So that's kind of how we're approaching it this year. And certainly that'll develop and we'll iterate on that. But with the tools that we have at our disposal, that's the approach that we're going to take.
It's almost 4 o'clock. I know you have to leave at 4, so one quick question I say, and then I'll let you go.
With that, since you have 4 different companies, do they have their own section of the city that they're putting their scooters, or
No.
are they all over? And then the data, is that available to all the companies together? So if a complaint comes in a certain area with 4 different companies, it might not be hit as a hotspot of a problem.
Any complaint that gets sent through 3-in-1 or the C-Click Fix app would have a company name associated with it, and it gets directed to the company itself. So they see those complaints, and it goes into our queue as well. Companies cover the entire city, so it's really up to them to monitor that through their customer service support team and address accordingly. So that's how the effort is coordinated. They don't have each other's data. That's something that, like, if we were to say to them, hey, there were 30 complaints on 6th and Nicollet, it would just be a general statement of, can you watch this area for scooters that you have available there? So that would be the effort.
All right. Well, that will wrap up the presentation.